This is the Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life.
Imagine this deeply personal conflict. You have found the person you want to spend your entire life with, you get married, and then suddenly the full weight of the state comes crashing down on you.
Exactly. You're arrested, you're convicted of a felony, and then you're given this brutal choice.
An impossible choice. Either dissolve your family or face 25 years of banishment from your home state.
That is the reality that faced Mildred and Richard Loving. And that incredible human drama launched, one of the most defining civil rights decisions in American history.
So for this deep dive, we are examining Loving v. Virginia, the 1967 landmark Supreme Court case.
And it finally settled the question of whether a state could legally define who you're allowed to marry based, solely on the color of your skin.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the stakes here were just astronomical. This wasn't just about a rule.
Not at all. This was about the state telling a couple, you cannot exist here as a unit.
And our mission today is to show you how their fight dismantled state-sponsored racial discrimination in relationships.
Look, if you take away just one thing from this deep dive, let it be this. The Supreme Court held that race-based laws restricting the fundamental right to marry violate the 14th Amendment, period.
Making those laws immediately unconstitutional.
Right. That's the core of it.
To really feel the weight of that ruling, though, we have to start with the Lovings themselves. This is the story of Mildred Jeter, a black woman.
And Richard Loving, a white man, both from Caroline County, Virginia.
And the world they lived in, Virginia, in 1958 was, it was defined by these really aggressive laws.
Anti-miscegenation statutes. They were rooted in the state's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, and they had one specific goal: maintaining racial classifications.
So Mildred and Richard were in love, they wanted to get married, but they knew they couldn't do it legally in Virginia.
So what did? They do what a lot of couples did. They drove across state lines to Washington, D.C., where interracial marriage was legal.
And they got married in June of 1958.
They married, they returned home to Virginia to start their life together, and that's when the state's enforcement mechanism just kicked in.
They were immediately prosecuted. This wasn't some old, forgotten law on the books.
No, the state actively sought them out and charged them with a felony.
The legal system moved fast. They were indicted in October and with a sentence of 1 year in jail.
But the trial judge offered them this horrific kind of deal.
A deal that wasn't a deal at all.
Exactly. The sentence was suspended for 25 years, but only on the explicit, brutal condition that they leave Virginia.
And not return together during that time, a quarter century.
They were forcibly exiled from their community, their family, their entire lives, just for holding a marriage certificate. That condition, it just shows you the human impact of these laws.
25 years of banishment. Just think about that. And we have to mention the philosophy behind this punishment, which the judge spelled out.
Yes, the source material has this stunning quote from his opinion. He basically declared that God created separate races and intended for them to remain apart.
So enforcing these laws was, what, upholding divine will?
That was his argument. It's a shocking statement that perfectly encapsulates the ideology behind the whole statute.
Right, so that rationale shows this wasn't about some legal technicality. It was about protecting a discriminatory social order.
So the Lovings moved to D.C. after their conviction, but, they refused to just accept this forever.
And so began the long road. In November 1963, about 5 years later, they filed a motion to vacate the judgment.
This started a slow appeal process through the state courts, which, predictably, upheld the statutes. But they kept fighting.
And finally, in 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear their case.
Which brings us directly to the central legal battle.
The ultimate question was whether Virginia's race-based marriage statutes violated the equal protection and due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. So let's get into the deep legal dive, starting with equal protection.
Right. So the Equal Protection Clause is vital here. It basically guarantees that states can't deny any person equal protection of the laws.
And since Virginia's law used explicit racial classifications, white versus non-white, the court had to use its highest standard of review.
That's right. It's called strict scrutiny.
Okay, strict scrutiny sounds incredibly intense. For listeners who aren't familiar, let's translate that. What does that actually mean for the state of Virginia?
It means that when a state uses race to classify people, the law is considered inherently suspect. The burden shifts entirely to the state, and it's an almost impossible hurdle.
And what do they have to prove?
Two things. First, that it has a compelling state interest, not just a good reason, but an absolute necessity. And second, that the law is narrowly tailored, meaning it uses the least restrictive means possible.
So Virginia had to somehow argue that maintaining racial integrity was a compelling state interest.
Precisely. And that sending the Lovings into exile for 25 years was the narrowly tailored way to do it.
And the court's reaction was?
They found that Virginia failed this test immediately. The court said the goal of preserving racial integrity wasn't the legitimate government purpose at all.
So any state interest rooted purely in racial discrimination is, by definition, unconstitutional.
It can never be compelling. That distinction is so crucial. The law wasn't just a little unfair. It was built on an ideology the Constitution was designed to eliminate.
But Virginia tried to defend it on technical grounds, right? They had this argument about the law being fair.
They did. That was their main defense. They claimed the statutes were applied equally because they punished both the white person and the black person in the marriage.
Wait, so their argument was that since the penalty was the same for Richard and for Mildred, there was no discrimination.
That's it. It's a deeply cynical argument.
So how did the court respond to that?
They just emphatically rejected it.
Yeah.
The court said that equal application doesn't remove the constitutional problem when the discrimination is inherent in the racial classification itself. They called the classifications invidious.
Let's pause on that word. Invidious. What does that really imply in this context?
It implies the classification is based on prejudice, on hostility, that it's designed specifically to restrict the rights of a group. And because the law's only justification was racial separation, the classifications themselves were just unsupportable.
So equal protection struck down the basis of the law, but the court didn't stop there. They also used the Due Process Clause.
Absolutely. The second constitutional hammer. The Due Process Clause ensures the state can't deprive you of liberty without, well, due process. And the court defined marriage as a fundamental liberty.
They called it one of the basic civil rights of man.
That definition is foundational, because when a state tries to restrict a fundamental right, that restriction is subject to the same high level of scrutiny.
So denying that right based solely on race was a deprivation of liberty.
Yes, the state was substituting its discriminatory policy for the individual's most personal choice.
And the decision was unanimous. They reversed the Virginia Supreme Court, invalidated the statutes nationwide, and ended the Lovings banishment.
And in doing so, they affirmed the entire purpose of the 14th Amendment, to eliminate all official state-sponsored racial discrimination.
What's fascinating here is that the court had to actively confront its own history.
Oh, absolutely. They couldn't just rule on the facts. Landmark cases like Loving often involve correcting past legal errors. The court specifically had to disavow reasoning from earlier cases that had upheld these kinds of laws.
Most notably, Pace v. Alabama from the 1880s.
Yes, that earlier decision, Pace, had bizarrely argued that similar laws were constitutional because both people in the marriage were equally penalized. The same failed argument Virginia tried to use.
And the Loving court basically said that reasoning was legally and morally bankrupt.
Completely. They made it clear that historical justifications can't override the central guarantee of equality. It was a clear constitutional realignment.
It's incredible to realize it took until 1967 for that to happen. So let's connect this to today. Why should you, the listener, care about Loving v. Virginia now?
Because its core principle is profoundly relevant. Loving established that the state cannot restrict the freedom to marry using these invidious classifications. It fundamentally elevated marriage to a protected, fundamental right.
So it built the framework. It taught us that if the state wants to interfere with a fundamental right like marriage, it needs a much better reason than prejudice.
Exactly. This precedent laid the groundwork for all later cases about the right to form relationships free from state interference. We see it cited constantly.
The source material mentions more contemporary case, Terry v. Yaden-Burrow. What does that 2013 case show us?
Terry shows that the protection goes beyond just the marriage itself. In that case, a police chief allegedly harassed and discriminated against a subordinate simply because that subordinate was in an interracial relationship.
So the issue wasn't the validity of the marriage, but discrimination based on the relationship itself. And what did the court rule?
It confirmed that discrimination against someone based on their interracial relationship is a violation of the 14th Amendment, and it cited Loving as the bedrock precedent.
So Loving didn't just strike down a law. It created a shield protecting the right to form these relationships from any official state harassment.
It secured a deeply personal liberty that we often take for granted today. The ability of the state to interfere in who you love and who you marry, that ended with this decision.
So for the final thought, the takeaway for you. The ultimate principle confirmed by the Supreme Court in Loving v. Virginia is that liberty means the power to define one's own life and happiness.
And that includes the fundamental decision of marriage. The state cannot replace an individual's free choice with its own policy of prejudice.
That confirmation, secured through the sacrifice and determination of Mildred and Richard Loving, remains absolutely essential to our concept of freedom today.
You've been listening to The Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with the next case.